Have you ever had to explain something to your child that broke your heart? Something they should never have to question? Today we share a powerful story, a black father's heartbreaking yet empowering journey when his son asks, "Dad, is my skin a curse?" What would you say if your child asked you that question? Subscribe and stay with us as we dive into a moment that changed everything. The sun cast a golden glow over the city as Elijah drove down Main Street, his son, Miles, in the back seat, humming along to the song on the radio. It was one of those rare Saturdays when Elijah didn't have to worry about work, emails, or meetings. Today was about Miles, his curious, bright-eyed 8-year-old son, who had been begging to visit Mercer & Co., an upscale boutique known for its high-end sneakers. Miles had saved up for months, carefully tucking away birthday money and allowances, dreaming of the day he could walk into the store and buy a pair of the limited edition sneakers he had been obsessing over. To Elijah, it was more than just a shopping trip. It was a father-son moment, a memory in the making. As he pulled into the parking lot, Miles bounced in his seat. "Dad, do you think they'll still have them?" Elijah smiled at his son's excitement. "I don't know, bud, but if they do, they're yours." Miles grinned, his dimples deepening. Best day ever. They walked into the store, the chime of the entrance bell announcing their arrival. The store was sleek and modern, lined with glass cases showcasing the latest sneakers, each one displayed like a work of art. The air smelled of new leather and polished floors. Miles' eyes widened with wonder. "Whoa." Elijah chuckled. "Go ahead, buddy. Find your shoes." As Miles excitedly made his way to the display, Elijah noticed something shift in the atmosphere. The warmth of the store felt suddenly cold. The employees, who had been smiling and assisting other customers, stopped. Their eyes flicked toward him and his son, then quickly away. A young woman behind the register whispered something to a coworker, and a tall, suited man, probably the manager, stepped out from the back. Elijah had felt this before, too many times to count. The unspoken suspicion, the silent calculations being made about him and his son. He exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral, unwilling to let anything ruin this moment for Miles. Meanwhile, Miles had found his prize. "Dad, look! They have them!" He held up a sleek pair of black and gold sneakers, his face beaming. Before Elijah could respond, the suited man stepped forward, his expression tight. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" His voice was polite, but there was a forced quality to it. Elijah kept his tone light. "My son's been saving up for these. He'd like to try them on." The manager's eyes flickered between them, his gaze lingering on Miles, then back to Elijah. "Those are high-end sneakers," he said slowly. "They're quite expensive." Miles eagerly reached into his pocket and pulled out a neat stack of bills, carefully counted and saved. "I have the money right here," he said proudly. The manager barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, but we reserve the right to refuse service." Elijah's stomach tightened. "Excuse me?" The manager's posture stiffened. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Miles's smile faltered. Confusion clouded his young face. "But why?" Elijah felt anger rise, but he pushed it down. This wasn't the first time he had been in a situation like this, but it was the first time Miles was old enough to notice, and that, more than anything, shattered him. Before Elijah could respond, another voice rang out. "What seems to be the problem here?" Heads turned. The store went silent. Standing at the entrance, dressed in his signature tailored suit, was none other than Mayor Elijah Carter, Miles's grandfather, and the look on his face made it clear that he had heard everything. The air in the store grew thick with tension as Mayor Elijah Carter stepped forward, his polished leather shoes echoing across the tiled floor. His presence alone commanded attention. A lifetime of leadership, hard-won battles, and a deep understanding of what it meant to walk into places like these as a black man had hardened his expression into one of quiet authority. The manager, who had moments ago been so sure of his authority, suddenly seemed to shrink. His polite indifference wavered, replaced with nervous uncertainty. "Mr. Carter," the manager stammered, forcing a smile. "I didn't realize." Mayor Carter held up a hand, cutting him off. His sharp eyes moved from the manager to Elijah, then to Miles, who stood frozen with the sneakers clutched tightly in his small hands. The mayor's jaw tensed as he turned his attention back to the manager. "What exactly is the issue here?" The manager swallowed. No issue, sir. Did you just refuse service to my grandson? The mayor's voice was even, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. The manager's face turned red. I wasn't refusing service. I just thought. You thought what? Mayor Carter's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority that had silenced entire city halls. That an 8-year-old child with money in his hands somehow wasn't qualified to shop in your store? The employees stood frozen behind the counter. A few customers, sensing the shift in energy, watched from a distance. The manager struggled for words. It was just a misunderstanding. Elijah, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. His voice was steady, but laced with something raw. It wasn't a misunderstanding. He turned to his father. He asked us to leave the store before Miles even had a chance to try the shoes on. The mayor let out a slow breath. He had lived through decades of these encounters, fought against them in boardrooms, courts, and the streets. And still, here they were. His grandson, at 8 years old, already learning the painful lesson of what it meant to be black in a world that too often saw his skin before his humanity. He turned to Miles, crouching down so they were eye level. Son, he said gently, tell me what happened. Miles hesitated, looking from his father to his grandfather. His little hands clutched the shoes tighter. I just wanted the sneakers, Grandpa, he said in a small voice. I saved up for them. I had enough money, but the man told us we had to leave. His eyes searched his grandfather's face for answers. Did I do something wrong? The question hit Elijah like a gut punch. He clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to breathe. Mayor Carter's expression softened, but only slightly. No, son, he said firmly. You did nothing wrong. Miles blinked up at him, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Then, why did he tell us to leave? Elijah braced himself. This was it, the moment he had always dreaded as a father. The moment when his son would first feel the sting of racism in a way he could no longer shield him from. Before he could respond, the mayor stood and turned back to the manager. His face was unreadable, but his voice was like thunder. You owe my grandson an apology. The manager's face twisted in embarrassment, but he nodded quickly. Of course. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. Mayor Carter folded his arms. That's not good enough. The manager shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I'll be filing a formal complaint, the mayor continued, and I expect a written statement outlining exactly how your store intends to address racial bias in its policies. He paused. That is, unless you'd rather we discuss this in a much more public forum. The weight of the mayor's words was clear. The manager nodded quickly. Of course, sir. Absolutely. We'll handle this immediately. The mayor glanced at Elijah. What do you want to do? Elijah looked down at Miles, who still held the sneakers. He wanted to tell his son they could leave, that they didn't need to give this store their money. But he also saw the quiet hope in Miles's eyes. This wasn't just about sneakers anymore. This was about proving something, to himself, to the world. Elijah exhaled. We'll take the shoes. The manager practically tripped over himself to ring up the purchase, fumbling with the box before handing it to Elijah. Miles looked up at his father, still unsure. Dad? Elijah crouched down, brushing a hand over his son's hair. You worked hard for this, buddy, he said gently. And no one has the right to take that from you. Miles nodded slowly. He didn't say anything, but the lesson had already begun to settle in. The world was different for him, and now he knew it. As they walked out of the store, sneakers in hand, Elijah knew that this wouldn't be the last time his son asked difficult questions. But he also knew he wouldn't be facing them alone. The car ride home was unusually quiet. Miles sat in the back seat, his new sneakers resting in the box on his lap. He wasn't smiling the way Elijah had imagined he would. Instead, he stared out the window, his little fingers tracing the edge of the box absent-mindedly. Elijah stole a glance at his father, Mayor Carter, who sat in the passenger seat with his jaw tight, staring straight ahead. He knew his father well enough to recognize that he was holding back his anger, containing it the way black men were taught to, because showing too much emotion could be dangerous. As they pulled into their driveway, Miles finally spoke. Dad? Elijah put the car in park and turned around. Yeah, bud? Miles hesitated, his small hands gripping the box tighter. Why did that man think I didn't belong in the store? Elijah's throat tightened. He had been dreading this conversation, but now there was no way around it. He sighed, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes people make assumptions about others based on things that have nothing to do with who they really are. Miles frowned. Like what? Elijah glanced at his father, who gave him a look that said, "This is your moment. You have to be the one to tell him." Elijah turned back to Miles. Like the color of their skin. Miles blinked up at him, confusion turning into something more painful. "But that's not fair." "No, it's not," Elijah said softly. Miles shifted in his seat, thinking, "Is that why the other people in the store got help but we didn't?" Elijah nodded. "Yeah." Miles looked down at the sneakers on his lap. "So, if I wasn't black, would that man have been nice to me?" Elijah felt like his heart was breaking. He swallowed hard. "Maybe. But listen to me, Miles. Being black isn't a bad thing. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of." Miles was quiet for a long moment, his little brow furrowed in thought. Then he looked up, and the next words that left his mouth nearly shattered Elijah completely. "Is my skin a curse?" Silence. Elijah felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Even his father, usually so composed, let out a sharp breath. Elijah turned fully in his seat, reaching for Miles' hand. "No," he said, his voice firm. "Never. Your skin is beautiful. Your skin carries the history of kings and queens, of inventors and leaders, of people who changed the world. Your skin is a blessing." Miles stared at him, his big brown eyes filled with questions he shouldn't have to ask at 8 years old. "Then why do people act like it's bad?" Elijah exhaled slowly. He wished he could tell his son that the world was fair, that kindness and hard work were enough to protect him from prejudice. But he couldn't. Because one day, Miles would grow up and face this world on his own, and Elijah needed him to be prepared. "It's because some people don't know any better," Mayor Carter finally said, his voice steady but heavy with experience. "But that's their problem, not yours." Miles looked down again, his fingers tightening around the sneaker box. "I just wanted the shoes," he whispered. Elijah felt his chest ache. He reached out and gently lifted his son's chin so their eyes met. "And you got them. No one could stop you. That's what matters." Miles nodded slowly. He wasn't smiling, but something in his face shifted, like he was beginning to understand something bigger than himself. Mayor Carter sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Come on, let's go inside." As they stepped into the house, Elijah knew this was only the beginning. There would be more conversations like this, more lessons, more difficult questions. But as he watched Miles carefully place the sneakers on the shelf in his room, he promised himself one thing: his son would never question his worth again. Later that evening, Elijah sat on the couch, watching Miles on the floor, carefully lacing up his new sneakers. The boy's face was serious, his fingers moving with care, but the excitement that should have been there, the pure joy of a child with something he had worked for, was missing. The weight of the day still lingered in his small shoulders. Mayor Carter sat in his usual chair, silent, nursing a glass of water. He had been like that for most of the evening, watching, thinking. Elijah knew his father well enough to recognize when he was carrying something heavy. "Miles," the mayor said finally, breaking the silence. "Come here, son." Miles glanced at his father for permission before standing up and walking over to his grandfather. The mayor patted the couch beside him, and Miles climbed up. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his deep voice steady. "When I was your age, something like this happened to me." Miles's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" The mayor nodded. "I was about 10 years old. Your great-grandfather took me to a diner. It was a small place, nothing fancy, but I had been looking forward to it all week. I wanted a slice of peach cobbler. They had the best in town." He smiled slightly, as if he could still taste it. "But when we walked in," he continued, "the man behind the counter looked at us and shook his head. 'We don't serve your kind here,' he said." Miles frowned. "Your kind?" The mayor nodded. He meant black people. Back then, there were places where people like us weren't allowed to sit and eat just because of our skin. Miles looked horrified. "That's not fair." "No, it wasn't," the mayor agreed. "I was just a boy. I didn't understand why they didn't want us there. I remember looking up at my father, waiting for him to get mad. But you know what he did?" Miles shook his head. He stood tall, looked the man straight in the eyes, and said, "Then we'll take our business somewhere else." He took my hand and we left. Elijah watched as Miles listened, absorbing every word. "Did you ever go back?" Miles asked. The mayor's smile was sad. "No, but years later, when I was elected mayor, that same diner, now owned by someone else, invited me in for a meal. This time, I sat at the best table in the house." Miles's eyes widened. "So things changed?" The mayor nodded. "Yes, but not by accident. They changed because people like your father, your grandfather, and so many others fought to make the world better, and we're still fighting." He reached out, resting a large, steady hand on Miles's shoulder. "That's why I need you to always remember, you are not less than anyone. No one can make you feel small unless you let them." Miles was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked down at his sneakers and back up at his grandfather. "So I should wear my shoes proudly, huh?" The mayor chuckled. "That's right. Wear them, walk tall, and know that you belong anywhere you set foot." Elijah saw the moment something shifted in Miles. Like the weight of the day wasn't quite as heavy anymore. As Miles hopped off the couch and ran back to his sneakers, Elijah met his father's eyes. "Thanks, Dad." Mayor Carter simply nodded. "It's our job to prepare him for the world, son, because one day he'll have to walk into places without us." Elijah swallowed, glancing at his son, who was now admiring his sneakers in the mirror. He knew his father was right, and he knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, Miles woke up earlier than usual. Elijah could hear the soft shuffle of his son's feet on the wooden floor before the boy appeared in the doorway, already dressed. The new sneakers were laced up tightly on his feet, looking crisp and untouched. Elijah sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes. "You're up early." Miles nodded. "I wanted to wear my shoes to school today." Elijah smiled. "Good choice." He knew today was more than just a regular school day for Miles. It was a silent act of defiance, a decision to own his space in the world. At breakfast, Mayor Carter watched as Miles carefully chewed his toast, his small legs swinging under the table. "You look sharp," the mayor said, nodding at the sneakers. Miles grinned. "Thanks, Grandpa." Before they left for school, Elijah crouched down to tie his own sneakers. "You ready?" Miles hesitated for a second. "What if someone at school says something mean about me?" Elijah met his son's eyes. "What do we do when people try to make us feel small?" Miles straightened his back, repeating what his grandfather had told him the night before. "We stand tall." Elijah smiled and held out his fist. "That's right." Miles bumped his father's fist, then took a deep breath and grabbed his backpack. "Let's go." At the school drop-off, Miles stepped out of the car, shoulders squared, sneakers gleaming under the morning sun. Elijah watched as his son walked towards the entrance, head high, confidence returning with every step. And then it happened. A group of kids stood by the front doors, laughing and joking. One of them, a taller boy with blonde hair, looked at Miles's sneakers, then at Miles. "Nice shoes," he said, smirking. "Bet you had to steal 'em." Elijah tensed in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He was about to step out, but then he saw Miles stop. The boy turned to the other kid, his face unreadable. For a moment, Elijah feared he would shrink, that the words would cut him down. But then, Miles did something Elijah hadn't expected. He smiled. "Nah," Miles said. "I worked hard for these." He tapped the side of his sneaker, letting the moment settle before adding, "And I look good in 'em, too." The taller boy blinked, momentarily thrown off, but Miles had already walked past him, stepping into the school with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. Elijah exhaled, pride swelling in his chest. As he pulled away from the school, he thought about how much his son had grown in just a day. And he knew that no matter what the world threw at him, much his son had grown in just a day. And he knew that no matter what the world threw at him, Miles would be ready. That evening, Elijah sat alone on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The golden light stretched across the yard, casting long shadows. Inside, he could hear Miles laughing as he played video games in the living room. The sound warmed him, but his mind was still stuck on the events of the day. Miles had handled himself well, better than Elijah had expected. The way he had stood his ground, met ignorance with confidence, had been a proud moment. But deep down, it also unsettled him, because the truth was his son was only 10 years old, and already facing the weight of the world's biases. 10 years old, and already learning lessons that children his age shouldn't have to. Elijah thought back to his own childhood. He remembered being in Miles' shoes once, the sting of knowing that some people would see him as less than before he ever got the chance to prove otherwise. He remembered the talks his father had given him, the same talks he was now giving Miles. His father had prepared him for the world, just like his grandfather had prepared him before that. And now, the responsibility had passed to Elijah. What do you think? Have you ever experienced a moment like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more impactful stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload.